I usually start projects with a pattern, but not this time. A mother and daughter walked into my store and asked if I could build something special for a child, a step stool where the child's name actually comes out as colorful letters. No pattern, just dimensions and an idea. Let's see if we can turn that into something a family will treasure for years. Usually I start out with a pattern from somewhere else, toymakingplans.com or from Steve Good. I don't have a pattern this time. I have some pictures I took of a mother and daughter came into the store, my retail store, in December, and they wanted to know if I could make something for them, a custom item. But anyway, it's a step stool for a child to use, and their name is in the top, but the name comes out as separate letters, and they're painted bright colors. That's what I'm working on today, and I have no pattern, nothing other than I took some dimensions of what they gave me, and I'm going to proceed from there. So the first thing is the name, which would be cut into the top. And so I showed them some different woods, and since they wanted it painted, I suggested maple. So I cut 2 maple blanks. I actually got 2 of each because I'm going to make another one for display for the store. But 1 3/4 thick, 1 inch, 1/2 inch thick. They're 12 inches long and about 9.5 wide. Thankfully I have a wide piece of maple in stock. And I'm going to cut the name into the 3/4 inch thick. Top is the first step, and the name is here. It's Emiko. And in case you're not wondering, it's an unusual name. The father is Caucasian, the mother is Japanese. So it's a Japanese name, Emiko. I'm going to cut that so the letters will be, I'll show you as I'm cutting it, but I'm going to be cutting it so the letters will touch each other, but they'll be separate. And so it's an aid for the child to learn to spell their name, and a personal item. I found a font that I liked on Canva and printed it large enough to fit on the stool's top nicely. I took some time to center the name both horizontally and vertically, and then I used scroll saw tape to adhere the name to the wood. I drilled a 1/8 pilot hole near the upper left-hand corner of the first letter, not inside the letter, because I didn't want it to have a missing piece. I also drilled a pilot hole for the center of the letter O. I thought it would look better that way rather than leave the center intact. I also thought that if it was left in place, it would be too easy to break as the letter was constantly removed and replaced. I'm using a number 9 Pegasus modified geometry blade to cut out the letters for a couple of reasons. The first is because this is 3/4 inch thick maple, so the wood is very hard. The second is that I want a wide kerf because these letters will need to slide in and out of the top, and a wider kerf should make that easier. If you have never cut letters printed out fully in black before, as opposed to cutting along a thin line, you may find this is not that easy to do. I found I had to concentrate a bit harder to keep the blade right on the edge of the print than when following a thin line. The letter E has some sharp corners, and cutting these with a larger blade is a bit more challenging than cutting sharp corners with a smaller blade, but the technique is the same. And the fact that the only waste area on these cuts is the saw blade kerf adds a bit more to the care required in making them. When I came to a 90-degree turn, I cut right up to the intersection, stopped pushing the wood into the blade, backed a minuscule amount into the kerf just created, and very slowly and carefully pivoted the workpiece 90 degrees. Then I was able to start pushing the workpiece into the blade again. I cut until I reached the next intersection, then used the same technique. Making curves is easy. Just follow the edge of the pattern. I almost said the line out of habit. Keep the workpiece moving and let the blade do the work. Cutting 3/4 inch maple takes time, and you don't want the blade to overheat and burn the wood or to flex and leave an uneven cut. I completed the cut, removed the blade, and when I picked up the workpiece, the letter E slid easily out of the bottom. That was, I thought at the time, a good sign. I pulled the tape off the front of the E and it looked good. There was a bit of a rough spot near the pilot hole, but a little bit of sanding will take care of that. I use a lighted magnifier with my scroll saw because it helps me to see the cut line more clearly. I noticed my vision changed when I was in my 40s. I was in the Army Reserve and did not shoot as well as usual for the annual M16 weapons qualification. The target used to zero the weapon is only 25 meters away. That's about 75 feet for anyone not familiar with the metric system. And my shot group was not as tight as usual. Not long after that weekend, I visited an optometrist and found that my depth perception was off and needed correction. I've worn glasses ever since. Anyway, I brought that up as a reminder that even if your vision is excellent, a magnifier with a light is worth considering. The lines on some scroll saw patterns can be hard to see, and the magnifier helps with accuracy as well as minimizing the possibility of eye strain if you're cutting for long periods of time. There weren't any particular problems or tips to point out while cutting the letter M. Cutting the letter is merely a matter of taking your time and letting the blade do the work. Don't try to rush it because you don't want the blade to flex, overheat, or break. Because these letters are intended to fit back into the footstool's top, there are no waste areas, and any mistakes will show up forever in the finished project. It took me 3.5 minutes to cut this one letter because I was going slowly and carefully.
One of the sections that was not part of the letter M broke when I removed the letter from the top. I wasn't surprised because it was being held to the top by just a tiny amount of material. But the 3/4 top will be glued to a 1/2-inch bottom once I'm done cutting all the letters, so I'll carefully save this piece and glue it to the bottom. It may eventually break from constantly taking the letters in and out, but it's small enough that I don't think it'll be a distraction if it does. For now, I'll set the piece aside so it doesn't get broken again. Having a lowercase I raised a question. What should I do about the dot over the letter? I thought about it for some time, tried to decide how the top would look with and without the dot, and finally left it undone. It would have been difficult to have it look right with a pilot hole in or next to it, and it would have been so small that the dot would be easy to lose when it was removed from the top. What do you think? What would you have done? Leave an answer in the comments. The letter I was easy to cut, so I don't have any tips or tricks for you if you ever want to make one that contains a lowercase I. The letter K was next, and it was another letter that didn't need any explanation for how to make the cut. I didn't have any tips or tricks for this letter. It was just another case of following the line and letting the blade do the work. It took about 2.5 minutes to cut, so I sped up the video to get through this cut and onto the next one. The inside of the letter O presented one of those quandaries like the dot over the letter I did. What was the best way to deal with this little piece? I decided that having a small open spot on the step stool's top was not going to be a problem, so I cut out the middle and tossed the scrap piece. So now the only letter left to cut was the letter O, which was easy and only took a short while. With all the letters cut, it's time to move on to the next phase of the project. I used a 1/4 sheet of 120 grit sandpaper folded in half to ease the edges of the letters before I started painting them. The 38-year-old sample I was shown as an example for building this new step stool looked like the letters and the slots they fit into had been rounded over with a router, but I felt that might be too much, so I just used sandpaper. I purchased a new set of acrylic paints for this project and the other step stools I plan on making soon. The examples of step stools I've seen online seem to use the full spectrum of the rainbow in order: red, orange, yellow, green, and blue. I would normally do the painting in my finishing room, but it's rather cramped and difficult to get the video camera in there on a tripod, so I'm going to paint these on one of my workbenches. I'm using a plastic mixing piece to hold the paint because I don't want to stick the brush into the paint containers. This risks mixing colors, and I don't want to do that, especially with new paints. I'll squeeze a bit of each color onto the mixer and pick it up onto the brush from there. When I finish one color, I'll thoroughly rinse the brush before moving on to the next color. I'm only going to paint the top surface of each letter. There doesn't seem to be any need to paint the sides or bottom, as they won't be seen except when the letters are removed from the top. I also know that painting wood can cause the grain to expand because it soaks up water from the paint. If the letters expand from painting, they might not fit back into their spaces very well. These are acrylic paints that absorb into the wood grain and require multiple coats. They dry quickly, so it won't take long to apply several coats. After the last coat, I'll apply a general finish top coat over these, as well as the rest of the step stool's top and bottom. It's time to glue the two layers together that make up the top. That little piece you see sticking up from the bottom layer on the right is the piece from the M that broke off when I was cutting the letters. I glued it in place first, carefully using the M to make sure it was properly aligned. Now I'm using a medium-sized bottle to spread a generous amount of glue onto the top layer. I'm using Tight Bond white glue because it has a reasonable setup time and it dries clear. With the glue applied, I used an acid brush to spread it around evenly on the top piece. Then I added some glue around the edges of the bottom piece, avoiding the center area where the letters would be, even though I wouldn't put them in place until, well, after the glue had dried. I wanted to be able to get finish to those spots later, and finish won't adhere to a spot that has glue on it. I set the two pieces aside to let the glue start curing a bit before I added clamps. I do this because when you first apply glue, it's quite slippery, and if you add clamps immediately, the pieces may want to slide out of alignment. Waiting a few minutes makes clamping easier, especially if you're using F clamps as I am here. I put one clamp in each corner, then one in the middle of each side and each end. There was some squeeze out, and that's a good sign. No glue squeeze out may mean you didn't use enough glue, whereas excessive squeeze out may mean that you clamped the pieces too tightly. You should always aim for a Goldilocks amount of squeeze out, and clean up with a damp cloth while the glue is still wet. Projects like this remind me of why I love custom woodworking. You're not just making an object, you're making memories. If you enjoy making projects that are both practical and memorable, 2 suggestions for what to watch next are on the screen right now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next project.